Wilt here, talking about affordable anamorphic adapters. This will be a whirlwind introduction to the topic. I'll have lots of website references and pointers for more info, but don't worry, there'll be a link at the end with a list of all the URLs. Also, please note that I'll be doing demos with lenses I happen to have handy, some of which I bought and some of which were sent to me for reviews. I'm not promoting these lenses, I'm just using them to show off things. Okay, let's begin. So, why anamorphics? These things come in waves. Back in the 1950s, anamorphic films flooded into theaters along with 3D as ways to differentiate cinema from television. Anamorphics created a widescreen picture from a single strip of film, and unlike 3D, it's the modern miracle you see without glasses. We had another wave of 3D and anamorphics in the 70s and 80s, and now here they are again. The 3D wave may have crested, but it seems like there are more anamorphic lenses in productions all the time. But these days you don't shoot anamorphic for a wider picture, so much as to get what Panavision calls the 5 pillars of anamorphic. You have the bokeh, the disproportionate breathing that occurs when you focus, the famous horizontal flare, the difference in magnification and perspective you get with an anamorphic lens, and an organic focus roll-off due to the softness and aberrations of anamorphic lenses. There are plenty of self-contained anamorphic lenses available, both vintage and modern, but they won't do you any good if you have a fixed lens camera or if you can't accommodate the mounting system they use. Also, they're pretty pricey to buy and even to rent, and that's assuming you can find them in your local area in the first place. Instead, I'm going to focus on anamorphic adapters you attach in front of your existing lenses. They're a great way to experiment with the format without busting your bank account, and they work on anything from camcorders to DSLRs to Cine cameras. But they do have some unique challenges with alignment and focusing. Let's look at the functional differences. Squeeze ratios are typically 1.33, 1.5, or 2:1. The 1.33 lenses were often used to turn 4:3 standard def into 16:9 widescreen, and are now used to make 16:9 into 2.37:1 wider screen. The 2.0 squeeze was used in the original hyperdonar lens of 1926. Yes, it's the 90th anniversary of anamorphics, and it's the most common cinemascope squeeze ratio. 1.5 is an intermediate ratio popular in consumer photography towards the end of the last century, mostly due to the excellent Iskarama lenses. 1.5 times is seen a revival, and Richard Gale in the UK is developing the Oliviascope 1.5 focusing adapter. 1.33 lenses, like the older Century Optics, Optets, and Panasonic LA7200, are usually fixed focus adapters, referred to nowadays as focus through. To keep them sharp at close focusing distances, you need to stop them down or add diopter lenses. Most, if not all, of the 1.5 and 2.0 times adapters are focusable. Single focus adapters, like the Iskaramas, have a variable diopter front element that focuses the entire picture with a single control. Dual focus adapters have their own focus settings in addition to the focus ring on the taking lens they're used with. Some projection anamorphics, like these Schneiders, which are frequently repurposed as shooting lenses, have focus settings that simply aren't usable for live focus pulling. In the past year or two, single focus attachments have appeared that let you turn many of the dual focus adapters into single focus lenses, and these have made focus pulling with anamorphic adapters much more practical. The main players are the very highly regarded, very sharp Rectolux 3FF and Core DNA modules. These are made by John Barlow in the UK. And here's the Core DNA mounted on a number of different lenses. Also, the softer but very widely available SLR Magic rangefinder Cine adapters, both with calibrated markings and without, with a slightly smaller mounting that won't work on a lot of the anamorphics out there. So if you're going to use it with either the SLR Magic anamorphic lenses or a bunch of the others, you probably want the more expensive rangefinder Cine. There's also the focus module from Anamorphic Shop in Lithuania. This is sold out. I think it's discontinued. The Anamorphic Shop people tell me there's a focus module too in process. Vintage adapters and projection anamorphics are usually mounted using a variety of third-party adapter clamps as they lack standard filter-type threads. So you can get these from people like Redstan or Rapido Technology or VidAtlantic. Current adapters, things like the SLR Magic, mount using stepping rings on the front filter threads of a lens, or they'll clamp directly to the front of the lens, like this Lettuce anamorphic adapter. Another option is to mount the adapter directly to a rig and let the taking lens float free behind it. So when we talked about shooting anamorphic and getting a widescreen picture, a whole bunch of different aspect ratios come up in discussion. Let's see where they came from. Initially, with 35mm film, you'd shoot full aperture 4x3. You'd put a 2:1 anamorphic lens on it. You'd get a 2.66:1 image. That was fine, but that was for a full-frame picture. There was no room on the print film for soundtrack. So they went to 4 magnetic tracks, narrower perfs. That took a bit of room away from the side of the picture. You wound up with a 2.55:1 actual aspect ratio on your print. Technology evolved. Print film went to optical sound, first with a combined magnetic and optical soundtrack, and then eventually a full optical soundtrack. And that required a further narrowing of the picture, slightly more, down to about 2.35:1. And 2.35:1 was the number that held for 10 or 15 years. The trouble was that any splices that occurred on the frame line tended to be visible if the projector were misframed. So to reduce the visibility of that, the projector was masked down to a slightly shorter picture, and that gave us 2.39:1, which is the widescreen number that has held to the current day. It's part of the DCI spec. It's actually 2.38694 and a bunch of other digits, but who's counting? We'll come back to that and where that number came from a bit later on. You'll often see this written up as 2.4:1 or a 1.2:1 camera aperture. This is very, very close. As you can see, the yellow frame overlays the green frame almost entirely. The difference isn't worth worrying about. Other numbers you're going to see, 2.37:1. This is a 16:9 shooting aperture with a 1.33:1 anamorphic on it. Again, it's very close to 2.39:1. And you'll also see 3.56:1. This is the result of a 2:1 anamorphic lens on a 16:9 sensor, and it's a very wide picture indeed. Indeed, it's so wide it spilled clean off the edge of my frame on either side here. So what I'm going to do is renormalize everything to a common width instead of a common height, because these are how the formats would appear if you projected them on a screen of a common width. And what we can see is that all the common ratios we normally talk about, 2.35:1, 2.37, 2.39, 2.4, essentially they're all the same in terms of framing. There are the outliers, the original two formats, and the super widescreen 3.56:1. But if we just talked about the common widescreen format, the DCI spec of 2.39:1, that's the sort of thing that you normally wind up shooting for. And that's what I'm going to focus on as the aspect ratio for the rest of the presentation. So what does this mean for us when we're shooting? Let's take our standard 16:9 sensor and put a 1.33:1 anamorphic lens on it. Here's the view through our viewfinder or on our LCD. We're using a Siemens star as our focus target because it gives us both focus and aspect ratio information. Let's go ahead and throw a 1.33:1 lens on it, and we'll get rid of the viewfinder dump now that we know what we're talking about. Just look at our picture. We take this squeezed down picture into post, stretch it back out 1.33:1, we wind up with a 2.37:1 image. Now, if we look at how that fits into our 2.39:1 picture, it fits fine. There's a little bit of black on either side of it, which we can get rid of in a couple of ways. We can either stretch it laterally a little bit more, about 0.7% wider, and it'll fit perfectly. It's quite all right to do because 1.33:1 isn't an exact number, as we'll talk about later. But if that offends your moral sensibilities, go ahead, just stretch the picture 1.33:1 and scale the whole thing up 0.7% more. You may have to trim a few stand lines top and bottom, but you'll have your 2.39:1 image. Now let's see what happens if we're using a 1.5:1 lens, like an Iskorama. It's squished down a bit more, as you might expect. We take it into post, we stretch it back out 1.5:1, wind up with a 2.66:1 image. Go ahead and mask that down to 2.39:1, trim off about 5% on either side, translate this back into what we see in our viewfinder when we're shooting. We wind up with a capture aspect ratio of 1.59:1. We're using about 90% of the picture width for a 2.39:1 final image. Now let's take our 16:9 sensor and put a 2:1 anamorphic on it. As you might expect, the image is squashed quite a bit laterally. Take it into post, stretch it back out 2 times, get a 3.56:1 total image width. If we mask that down to 2.39:1, and then translate that back into the actual clear aperture for shooting, we wind up shooting a capture aspect ratio of 1.195:1, using 67% of the total picture width for our 239:1 final image. So to summarize the rules for 16:9 capture formats, if you're shooting with a 1.33 anamorphic lens, you use the full image width for your final 2.39:1 output picture. If you're shooting 1.5:1 anamorphic, you use 90% of the image width, and if you're shooting with a 2:1 anamorphic, you use 67% of the image width for your output picture at 2.39:1 aspect ratio. Now let's consider what would happen if you're shooting with a 4x3 sensor and a 1.33:1 anamorphic lens. Here's what appears through our viewfinder or on our LCD. Stretch it back out in post. Hey presto, 16:9, we're done. That's what the 133 lenses were used for with 4x3 standard def cameras, was to make a 16:9 picture. Now let's take the 4x3 sensor and put a 1.5 squish lens on it. Through the viewfinder or on the LCD, our squish down picture, stretch it back out in post, we wind up with 2:1. If we were shooting House of Cards, we'd be done. That's its release format. Let's try masking it to 2.39:1. Not quite wide enough, but we masked it to 16:9 and it fits very nicely. Translate that back to our shooting aperture. We're using a capture aspect ratio of 1.195:1, using 90% of the picture width for a 16:9 output image. Very efficient use of the sensor. Now let's put a 2:1 anamorphic lens on our 4x3 sensor. We have a very squished down picture, which we stretch back out in post 2 times, wind up with a 2.66:1 image. That we can mask down nicely to 2.39:1, and when we translate that back into our shooting aperture, we see something interesting. Once again, we've got a capture aspect ratio of 1.195:1, using 90% of the image, this time for a 2.39:1 final output. So to recap the rules for 4x3 capture formats, with a 1.33:1 anamorphic, you wind up using the full image for a 16:9 final output picture. With a 1.5:1 anamorphic, 90% of the image width is used for a 16:9 output, and if you have a 2:1 anamorphic, you use that same 90% of the image for a 2.39:1 output. Some cameras take it one step further with a 1.2:1 capture format. In that case, a 1.5:1 anamorphic uses the full image width for a 16:9 output, and a 2:1 anamorphic uses the full image width for 2.39:1. These are the numbers you'll want to use to mask off the image width on the monitor of your camera to see what the limits of your final output image will be. So let's take a look at the demo gear we're going to use and build ourselves an anamorphic rig. At the top left, I have the Panasonic LA7200 from about 2003, a 1.33:1 anamorphic. Top right, the SLR Magic 2.0. Bottom left, SLR Magic 1.33. And at the right, the rangefinder single focus adapter. Oh yeah, we're going to need a bunch of adapter rings, step up and step down rings, to put these adapters on the various prime lenses and taking lenses we're going to use. Another view of the two SLR Magic lenses, the 133 on the left, the 2.0 on the right. Notice how much squishier the picture is on the 2.0 lens. I'm going to put these anamorphics on lenses attached to a Panasonic GH4, an ideal camera for anamorphic work because it has both 16:9 and 4x3 shooting modes. And here are the main lenses I'm going to be putting behind those anamorphics. There's the Panasonic 12 to 35mm zoom, a couple of Vedra mini primes, and a more traditional Voigtlander Nocton 25mm. The 12 to 35 is an ideal lens for this purpose, despite its being a modern zoom. It covers the right focal length range, at least for the 2.0, and when I focus it and when I zoom it, the front end of the lens stays in place. It doesn't extend, it doesn't contract, it doesn't rotate. It means anything I attach to it stays in the same place. The same is true with the Vedra mini primes. They're internal focus, so that doesn't change the front position of the attachment point, and the lenses are consistent so that anything I mount out in front of it, like a follow focus or a matte box, doesn't need to change when I move lenses. The Nocton is a somewhat different matter. It's a traditional helical coil focusing lens, so the entire lens barrel moves in or out as I focus. Why does that matter? Because the attachments we're going to put on it are not lightweight. Most of them weigh, the better part of a pound. Certainly the 1.33s, which are the light ones, are better than half a pound, almost 300 grams. And the 2.0 is a heavyweight lens indeed. It's over a pound, over half a kilogram. And then consider the rangefinder, this big heavy piece of glass that hangs out in front of that. That's 3/4 of a pound or 360 grams by itself. You stack it on top of the 2.0, now you're nearly a kilogram and over 2 pounds of weight. That's a lot of weight to hang on the filter threads of a lens. Not to mention the fact that it's moving back and forth, so any follow focus or support that you add is not going to be in the same place as you focus. And given the load, it makes it very hard to focus if I'm not supporting that front of the lens. So think of the wear and tear that's doing to the mechanism. Having said that, let's go ahead and build the kit. The SLR Magic uses 62mm thread, so I'm using a 58 to 62mm step-up ring on this lens to fit my various anamorphics on. One trick with the 7200, it has these recessed filter threads that were fine for the lens it was designed to go on, but make it very difficult for use on other lenses. So I'm adding a 72 to 77mm step-down ring onto the back of the lens. That brings my filter threads all the way to the back. Now I can use any adapter ring to mount this to a lens. And with the 62 to 77mm step-up ring on the back of the LA7200, I can simply attach it just as I would the SLR Magics, get it tightened down, align it, and there we have it. Attaching the SLR Magic 2 times anamorphic is a very similar procedure. Simply screw it in. It already has a 62mm thread, so it just bolts right in like that. But it's a very heavy lens and will drag the lens down on the mount by itself. So a lens support is pretty much essential for this kind of lens. I'll go ahead and add the rangefinder single focus attachment. It simply screws in just like any other filter does. Once it's screwed down all the way, I'll want to back it off until I can see the focusing line and get that positioned where I want it on the lens, and then tighten down the locking collar to lock that into place. That's a lot of mass to be hanging off a weak and unstable micro 4/3 mount, so I'll want to immobilize it. I'm going to use a Velcro strap and just strap it around my support rails, really pull that lens down firmly against the lens support, and lock it into place. This makes for a much more stable rig. Next, I'll add a follow focus because the rangefinder has a very nice 0.8 focus gear on it. So I can add a follow focus and do film style focus pulls and get much smoother results this way. One thing to watch out for is to make sure that locking collar is locked down tight. Otherwise, it's easy to break that lens free when I hit the end stops and spin it. I'm going to add a matte box because the rangefinder is very subject to flare. The rangefinder has a lot of focus travel on it, so I want to make sure I leave enough room between the back of any filters I put in the matte box and the front of the rangefinder that it's not going to interfere. Well, I started out with a nice, lightweight, simple GH4. Now I've built this huge, horrible monstrosity that pretty much has to live on a tripod. Maybe it can be handheld with some effort. The next step is making sure the adapter is properly aligned. This is the fun part and very critical. The adapters either have a screw on the side that you can loosen to rotate the lens, or in the case of this SLR Magic 1.33, there are 3 set screws you have to loosen. Others use a locking collar, either a screw collar like on the rangefinder, or a latching collar like on my 2.0 lens. But in any case, the lens has to be properly aligned so that our verticals and our horizontals line up properly. We don't wind up with an eddy, squishy shaped sort of thing. This is a fairly crucial part of the entire operation. This can be difficult to do if you don't have a monitor that de-squishes the picture for you. So I've zoomed in here on the detail. I'm trying to get square corners on this chart, but it's not held perfectly parallel to the plane of the camera. So if it looks like it's correct here when I'm zoomed in, when I pop back out, I'll see that my other verticals aren't vertical anymore. Now, if you have a monitor that unsquishes the picture for you, it's much easier to see what's going on, but you may not have this on set, especially if you're trying to run light, and it isn't always the easiest way to do things in any event. I found the best chart for my use is something round, like this resolution chart or a Siemens star. I'm not worried so much about getting corners to be right angles. I'm looking for the most even squish in my camera viewfinder of that circle. When it's balanced, I know I've got my alignment about as good as I can get it. The other trick, if your location is dark enough, is to use anamorphic flare to align the lens. Shine a bright light into the lens, try to get those flares horizontal. If you have an alignment grid in your viewfinder, as I have on my GH4, turn it on and try to get those flares parallel with the horizontal lines. When you get it right, your geometry is correct. Verticals are verticals, horizontals are horizontal. But don't be surprised if you wind up with shots like this every so often. It's going to happen to you even if you're as careful as you can possibly be. Don't despair, this sort of thing can be fixed in post. Now let's revisit that other bugaboo, the wobble and twist that these lenses can have. If I just take a look at my lens as it's stuck onto my Micro Four Thirds camera, I can wobble the lens and its mount, not just the anamorphic, but the taking lens. This leads to some wobble in the picture when I focus. There's enough torque on that rangefinder, or if I'm using a dual focus attachment just on the lens itself, to rotate things and make my picture unstable. That's why mobilizing the lens is so important. If we look at the lens without that restraining strap, we can see the whole thing flexing and quivering like something alive. Whereas if we tie it down, we have a much more rigid, much more stable operation. This makes a considerable difference in the quality of my focus pulls. Not only the way the picture is jumping up and down, but the way it's twisting subtly as I change focus directions when I rack focus back and forth. When the lens has been properly tied down and immobilized, now I have a very clean, very stable, much more professional looking focus operation. Now for the fun part, actually focusing the combination. Anamorphics are interesting in that they typically have different horizontal and vertical focusing points. So if I zoom into my test chart here and I focus my taking lens, I find that I can either focus horizontally or I can focus vertically, but I can't do both at the same time. So what I typically need to do if I have a dual focus kind of setup is focus vertically using my taking lens. Once I have that where I need it, go to my adapter and use it to focus the horizontals to match. That works very nicely if I have a focusing adapter, but if I'm using something like the 7200, I don't have that. So again, I can focus vertically or horizontally, but not both at the same time. So what I have to do for these sorts of lenses is simply stop down the lens, going down to f22 in this case. Now both my horizontals and verticals are in focus because my depth of field is so great. And that's certainly a workable sort of thing, but it's not ideal. Back when I used the 7200 on a DVX 100, I came up with this focusing table that maps minimum apertures for given settings of focal distance and focal length that would assure me adequate sharpness, if not ideal sharpness, in all my shots. Not especially convenient to use in the heat of battle, but there you have it. Now, if you do have a dual focus adapter, what about focusing live during a take? It can be done. As you can see, it's possible, but if you're going to also pan and tilt the camera, you need to have at least 3 hands, or preferably 1 or 2 camera assistants to help you with it. And when everyone's in sync and hitting their marks, you can actually get fairly good focus pulls with good synchronization between the horizontal and vertical, so that it looks like a natural, organic focus pull with both happening at the same time. Nevertheless, it's a fairly involved maneuver, and good luck if your actors don't hit their marks. It's not a convenient thing to do. Fortunately, we now have front focus adapters, the single focus adapters like this rangefinder. This makes it much easier to do a focus pull with just a single control, almost like on a real lens, and has revolutionized the use of anamorphic adapters in the past year or so. But notice something interesting. There's a very different feel to the way the two focus pulls work. The single focus adapter gives us that differential breathing, that change in aspect ratio that Panavision says is such a big deal. The dual focus gives us a more isomorphic breathing, just as if we were using a single spherical lens. It is a very different sort of feel to the way the two lenses pull focus. It holds for the 1.33x as well, not just the 2x. And that brings us to the question of actual aspect ratios and anamorphic mumps. So here's a chart about 4 feet away from the camera, shot without an anamorphic and with the anamorphic. Notice how the chart gets a little bit fatter when I have that anamorphic in there. This is the 7200 Panasonic. The same holds true if I'm shooting with the SLR Magic 1.33. Notice my foreground gets a little bit fatter, my background gets a little bit thinner. The same is true with the 2.0 lens. It's even more pronounced. This is what people refer to as mumps. Things close up tend to get a bit fatter. Interestingly, if I put the rangefinder on, it overcorrects for it on the 2.0 lens, and makes things just about perfect with a 1.33 lens. So if I just take a look at how things work, if I don't have the anamorphic lens, if I put the 2.0 lens on and go to 200% in my stretch, things are perhaps a bit too fat in the foreground. To make my foreground look good, I might need 191% stretch with this particular lens. The whole point of this is that the actual ratios and the numbers aren't sacrosanct. You may have to play with things a bit in post to get things to look the way they should. Let's talk a bit about viewfinding and how you guard that 2.39 safe area. Remember this chart from the theory section, the 90% and 67% numbers? Here's how we use them. Measure the active picture width on your camera's display, take the percentage of that, and then mark that out. I'm using blue painter's tape on your viewfinder so that you know where the edges of your 2.39 image are going to be. The same thing works for the 90% area. The outer 4 tape markers on my viewfinder are used for the 4:3 picture. A third-party viewfinder or monitor can be useful for de-squeezing the picture and showing you something more natural to work with when shooting. This Zacuto EVF has all 3 of the normal de-squeeze ratios you might need to run into. Although it doesn't show you a 2.39 crop, you can define frame lines to show that for you. When you go in for pixel magnification, the anamorphic effect is taken off. The video device's PIT-C recorders have a similar capability. You can pop into the menu and define the outputs on your LCD. You can turn on anamorphic, select from either a 4:3 or 16:9 style imager, and then pick the de-squeeze ratio you want that picture to be shown with. You can also choose between a full display, which I'm going to show here, the full 356 display, or you can come back in and set this monitor up to show you a 2.39:1 crop out of the center of it. As with the Zacuto, when you go in for a zoomed view, it takes the anamorphic effect off and shows you a magnified pixel-for-pixel version. The Convergent Design Odyssey series monitor recorders have very comprehensive anamorphic options. It has all 3 of the standard ratios, and I can look at a full picture width, 3.56 in this case. And I can also define guidelines to show me, in effect, my 239 extraction or any other aspect ratio I want to pull out of that. I can also go in and look at a crop version of it, doing a center extraction either 267:1, 239:1, or 178:1. I'll pick 239:1. And on this one, when I go in for my focus magnification, it preserves the anamorphic effect. Both the Odyssey and the PIT-C will supply a de-squeezed feed to their downstream outputs. Here I'm using the PIT-C to feed a Teradek cube, which is sending a de-anamorphosized picture in the proper aspect ratio out to handheld devices. So let's compare the different ways the 1.33 and 2.0 anamorphics render a picture compared to a flat lens. So the flat lens, the 1.33 and the 2.0, obviously a difference in the bokeh, also a very different rendering, a squishing laterally of the background. I've processed these in post so Barney winds up in exactly the same place in the same aspect ratio, regardless of slight differences in the lens. But overall, the 2.0 gives you more of what an anamorphic is for. So my preference is to shoot with the 2.0, given the choice between the different lenses. One problem with the 2.0 and the rangefinder combo is it's not especially sharp, not wide open. But if I stop it down, say to 5.6 as I've done here, it is a lot better. It's quite acceptably sharp. And yet there's still enough difference in my background and foreground in a shallow enough depth of field, I can still do a convincing focus pull. One of the nice things about anamorphic lenses is the horizontal flare. Let's look at some of it. The 7200 gives us this very nice magenta and purple flare. It's not excessive, but it is there. The SLR Magic 133 is much more emphatic about the blueness of its flare. The lens coatings emphasize that blue flare. If we put the rangefinder on, we also have this strange sort of semi-spherical stuff going on, that additional flare that rangefinder adds. The 2.0 is very similar. If anything, its flare is a bit more emphasized and a bit more interesting because of that additional squish. There are more elements in the lens, and that adds a bit of complexity to the quality of the flare. Now, the adapters are somewhat limited in their applicability, mostly by angle of view at the wide end and by focal length at the long end. The LA7200 can be used even on a 12mm lens on this camera in both 16:9 and in 4:3 modes. You can use the SLR Magic 1.33 on a 16mm lens if you don't mind a slight amount of vignetting in the corners in either the 4:3 or 16:9 modes. If you add the rangefinder, however, it's not going to work on the 16mm no matter what. You have to go to at least a 25mm. Now the 2.0 on the 16mm is just a little bit too long to be used in either case. On a 25mm, the SLR Magic 2.0 alone works fine. However, if you add the rangefinder, again, you're winding up with too much vignetting in the corners, and you wind up going to a 35mm or longer lens to make the 2.0 and rangefinder combination work. So this is at 35mm, f2.8 with the SLR Magic 2:1 anamorphic lens. If I zoom in, I'm focused on Barney here. I go in to about 50, still looks reasonably okay. 70mm, it's starting to go a little bit soft and funny. All the way to 100. Now at f2.8, I really can't get anything in focus. There's a fair amount of haze on top of the picture. And take a look at some of my exteriors and try to focus on that. You know, I really still can't get anything quite in focus out the window. Not at f2.8. Again, watch as I do the zoom. You'll see that horizontal smear come and go. So if I zoom back out, right about there, right around 50mm, the picture is fairly clean. But as I zoom in, I get that horizontal smearing running across the picture there. Not just the Venetian blinds, but actual smear on the highlights. That pretty much goes away back by around 50 or 60mm, and it's not a problem wider. Now if I go in and I start stopping down the lens, I'm at 2.8, 4, 5, 6, 8. Now again, I'm fairly clean at 8, so I can still use this lens as I zoom in or as I get a longer lens, but it's going to require me to shoot at smaller apertures. Okay, now you've shot anamorphic clips. What do you do with them? You'll need to de-squeeze them, scale them to fit in your desired final aspect ratio, and correct any other geometry problems. I'll show what I do in Final Cut Pro 10, but the tasks are the same in any other nonlinear editor. So in my timeline, I have a 4:3 clip and a 16:9 clip, both shot with a 2:1 anamorphic lens. Now, Final Cut has this interesting property that for a lot of clips, it has an anamorphic override setting that's available, which I can either force to standard or widescreen. It's not supposed to work with GH4 clips, but in fact it does. So just by setting that parameter, I've converted both these clips to widescreen. But there are two problems with this. First, Final Cut Pro assumes you're using a 2:1 squeeze lens. If you have a 1.33 or 1.5 anamorphic, you're out of luck. Second, FCP scales the clip to fill the width of the frame. So this 1.33 clip with a 2:1 lens is now a 2.66:1 clip, whereas the 16:9 clip with a 2:1 lens is now a 3.56:1 clip. I still need to wind up scaling stuff in my video tab to make those fit in an appropriate manner. I prefer not to do that. So what I'm going to do the scaling and the anamorphic correction all in one. So I'll take these two clips, I'll turn that widescreen flag back to none set, and I'll come in here into my video tab, and I will take the numbers. Now the numbers that we're going to use, remember that 2.3869, basically 239:1 number, that comes from the DCI 2K spec of 2048 by 858 pixels in the DCI image. When I scale this down to HD, I get the rather unfortunate 1920 by 804.375 pixels. It's hard to render 0.375 pixel, but let's leave that aside. If I take that as a proportion of 1080, that's a vertical height of 74.48%, times 2 gives me 148.96. And those are the numbers I need to use for the scaling tab in transforming this video. So if I come back over and I type in 148.96 and 74.48, bang, now I have a 2.39:1 image. I'll go ahead and turn my overview on. So there's my 2.66 image cropped in pushed in so I get a 2.39 to 1 image in my final rendered HD clip. So once I've got this, I can now come up into the File menu, and I can save a video effects preset where I'm saving just this transform information, and I can save it out as, say, 2.0, 2.39 to 1. And I've created a new category using new category called Anamorphic, which I'll put all my corrections in. Now I've actually done this already. So I've actually created effects for the 133 squish lens and the 20 squish lens for creating both 2.39 images and 16:9 full height images. So I can come back in here, I can just reset this clip, and I can come drag whichever I want, the 20 fill the frame with it, or the 2.39 fill the frame with 2.39 aspect ratio. And this also works regardless of what my actual shooting format was. Both the 133 and the 16:9 clips wind up as 239 to 1 images. So let me do that to a couple more clips I have here. So this is my fairly rectilinear focus pull. And here's the one I had before that has that unfortunate skew, which is a fact of life with these anamorphic adapters. It's very hard to ensure that they're going to be perfectly aligned on every shot. The beauty of Final Cut is I can come into my Distort tab, I can turn on Distort, and now holding down Shift and Command so that I only drag things in one direction, I can pull this back up and correct that. And notice how, because I've shot, in this case, a 2:6 to 1 image with a 4:3 imager and a 2 to 1 lens, I have enough information on the sides to do a fair amount of correction without cropping into the picture, without losing information in the picture. This is the advantage of shooting with the 4:3 setting, if my camera has it, as opposed to the 1.2 to 1 or 6 to 5 setting that the Blackmagic and the Red have, if I'm shooting with an anamorphic adapter as opposed to an anamorphic lens that fits and perfectly registers in that PL mount to be perfectly upright and linear. If you want more information, here are my top 3 suggestions. So grab a screenshot or find these links at provideocoalition.com/webinar-affordable-anamorphic-adapters, along with additional information there wasn't time to cover here. Andrew Reed's Anamorphic Guide might also interest you. The current version is 4 years old, so it doesn't cover the SLR Magic or the front focus adapters, but it is discounted. Or wait for the new version later this year. Andrew covers much of the same ground as Tito does, but with his own perspectives and opinions. I'd like to thank John Barlow of Rectilux, Tito Faradons, and Andrew Reed for graciously answering my pesky questions, and thank you for watching.